She came home with the plastic bag, a small bouquet sweating from the trip, and the metallic clack of a prescription bottle that bounced against the handle as she fumbled for her keys. The sun was a soft smear across the pavement, her arms a little tired from the errands. Groceries, a new blouse she had meant to return, the pharmacy stop after a checkup. The house smelled like lemon oil and the faint burn of coffee left in the pot. For a moment, the ordinary world reorganized itself around trivial comforts: the pattern of the rug, the phone on the kitchen counter, the framed photo of her and Isla at the Science Museum, grinning with cotton candy faces. She set the bag down. The door was unlocked. Marin Holloway did not pause to be surprised. The unlocked door made her chest drop in a hollow she had learned to notice. She slipped inside and called, low, as if speaking loudly might summon trouble. "Leo?" Silence answered, long enough that she could hear the refrigerator's small motor click behind the quiet. Then the glass of the hallway bookshelf trembled when she took another step. A perfume, warm and floral, something she had never seen on Leo's cologne list, spilled into the air ahead of her. There was a tilt to the family portrait on the mantel. A folded hotel key card lay on the bedside table like a last-minute confession. In the bedroom, sound filled everything: conversation, laughter, clipped. A voice she recognized as Leo's, private and casual. The room looked as if someone had tried to rewrite their life in a single afternoon. Scattered receipts, a silk scarf over a chair, a ledger half closed on the desk. The bed was a small battlefield. She had imagined other entrances: the quiet, the argument, a note. She had not imagined this heat of light and smell. Valentina Morrow moved in a way that suggested familiarity. She reached for a glass without looking. When Leo glanced up, the smile on his face was the same one he used when he read a favorable report or signed a large check: calm, assured, practiced. He had been a man of public statements and private arrangements. In the doorway, Marin felt something inside her go small and sharp and clean, like a snapped wire. Marin? Leah. No, her name was Valentina, turned fully, and the room went immediately quieter, as if objects held their breath. Isla's small backpack hung over an armchair where it did not belong. A child-sized shoe lay half-hidden under a heap of paperwork. Somewhere beyond the blinds, the city kept its civilized hum. Marin did one simple thing. She shut the door. She did not raise her voice. She did not stoop into accusation. She stepped forward, her hands suddenly methodical, and pulled her phone from her bag. For 2 seconds, she stared at the screen, and then, with a precision that surprised her, began to photograph. A close-up of a hotel card: Valentina Morrow, Suite 1104, 0912. A receipt: dinner at a downtown rooftop, champagne, and a note for private purchase. A worn leather journal with a pen tucked in the spine. The ink on the first page had the sweep of someone who wrote often in small private confidences. The perfume bottle by the sink, the way one of Leo's cufflinks was on the bedside table. A small folded bank notice peeking from under a tissue box. She photographed everything. She did not touch more than necessary. She said one sentence aloud, not to them, but to herself: "Take pictures. Lock the doors." There was a flash of stunned recognition: Leo's face, then Valentina's. Their conversation scrambled. The room changed color. Marin felt the heater in her throat, hot and steady. She walked to the foyer and turned the deadbolt. The sound was a single solid note. The lock slid into place. She set her bag down and called her mother. Catherine Holloway arrived before the afternoon had thinned to evening, wearing a composed urgency Marin admired. A coat buttoned to the throat, a paper bag of something from the farmer's market tucked under one arm. Catherine's eyes registered the room in a sweep, then softened at the sight of her daughter. She placed the bag on the kitchen counter sat without asking, and listened in the way of people who have practiced strategy over many small crises. "Who is she?" Catherine asked quietly. "Valentina," Marin said. The name sounded wrong in her mouth. "She was Isla's. She was my friend." Catherine did not offer consolation that could be folded away. She did what she had always done, arranged pieces on a board and asked calmly, "What do you want to do right now?" The answer came in practical syllables: preserve, record, protect. They moved through the house like archivists. Marin told Catherine what she had photographed. She pulled the little prescription bottle from the grocery bag and set it down, an ordinary domestic artifact given new meaning by the day. Isla, 9, was at a neighbor's after-school program for a late pickup. Marin sent a text to the woman at the program, short, coded, and said she would arrive in 10 minutes. She did not want Isa to come in and step on the shards she was shaping. Before Marin spoke to a single person outside the house, she did something else. She unclipped a small notebook she kept for work and started a log. Date, time, entry, observations, actions taken, witnesses. At the top she wrote, "Chain of custody begins now." She noted the phone model and the app she used for the timestamps. She saved images to the cloud with an autosync, then mailed a copy to her own secure email, the one she used for important documents, then locked the file with a passphrase she and Catherine shared. When she called Lydia Park, her attorney, it was with the same precision. Lydia answered on the second ring. "Tell me exactly what you have," Lydia said. Marin listed it: photographs, hotel card, receipts, cufflinks, an audio clip she had not yet opened, a leather journal. She described the room, the scent of perfume, the hotel key on the nightstand, the ledger with dates that matched transfers. She did not speculate about intention. She gave Lydia facts and the order she had preserved them in. "Don't post anything online," Lydia said. "Don't confront. We preserve integrity." She moved through the legal priorities as if ticking off colors on a map: preservation letters to the hotel and corporate accounts, instructions for a forensic tech, a subpoena-ready list. "We need to act quickly to preserve logs and room records," she said. "Don't let anyone touch the scene." "Do you think this?" Marin began. "We take evidence as evidence," Lydia said. "We do not assume guilt beyond what we can show, but we protect what you have." That was the moment Marin realized she was changing shape by design. The private jacketness folded into something coherent and strategic, because she wanted her daughter's name to remain unbowed, because she wanted the ledger, whoever had written in it, to be accounted for. The first CTA came after the initial containment, a small handhold offered to the audience in the hours after shock. Marin did not say it aloud. It came as a line Catherine said under her breath. "If you were Isa, what would you say to your father? Start with, 'I would say.'" It was an invitation to reflect, to place themselves in the child's quiet shoes, an attempt at empathy, not spectacle. Marin liked that it allowed people to speak without spectacle, to think about the child rather than the humiliation. Catherine called Jonah Reed next. Jonah arrived with a laptop bag and a quiet confidence that smelled faintly of coffee. He was the tech forensic specialist who had once recovered deleted files from a drive that software had claimed were gone. Jonah moved through evidence like a careful surgeon. He did not look surprised at the leather journal or the hotel key. He nodded at the photos Marin had taken, then asked the practical questions he always asked. What device took the photos? Are the original files available? Were any devices moved? "Hash everything," he said, and explained in 3 clean sentences for people who might not know the term. Hashing creates a digital fingerprint for a file. If the fingerprint stays the same, no one has altered the image. He talked about metadata, timestamps, GPS tags, timestamps from the cloud, and why those details mattered. "We save a copy on a secure server, and we keep the original phone in an evidence bag," he said. "We log who handles it.
Chain of custody is not just for court, it's for credibility. Rena Torres, the neighbor and owner of the bakery 2 blocks down, brought Isla home later that afternoon with a paper bag of warm croissants. She had seen the text and come without being asked, the kind of presence that was neither intrusive nor theatrical. Rena knelt to Isla with a practiced kindness.
The girl was small and solemn. The day's normal rhythms had been rearranged for her. Marin watched her daughter take the pastry and smile a little. The sight did something to steady Marin, an ordinary, fierce tenderness. "How was school?" Rena asked softly, and Isla spoke about a frog she had seen in science class. She did not have words for the rest. No 9-year-old should. Dr. Amir Patel, the family physician, called next, after a brief direction from Catherine. He listened as Marin explained, then told her what she already knew. Stress could unmoor a child, even if the child seemed outwardly composed. He advised gentle routines, predictable evenings, and minimal exposure until Marin and Catherine knew more. "Keep Isla's world small," he said. "Protect the ordinary." By dusk, the small group around Marin had shifted from shock to a working team. Lydia outlined the legal scaffolding in plain terms: preservation letters to hotels and telecoms, subpoenas for bank records, a request for ledger copies from Leo's office, and counsel on media strategy might interact with litigation. Jonah confirmed the technical steps for securing files. Benjamin Reed, no relation to Jonah, arrived with his business card. He was a journalist who had known Marin through community planning events and had followed her work on the transit project. He said he would wait for instructions. "I won't run anything without your say," he told her. "If you let me, I can help document facts and timelines for public clarity, but you decide the framing." Tomas Rivera, the bank relationship manager who knew Leo's accounts without intruding, provided a discreet line of advice about how to request transfers and flagged that certain patterns could be traced through client records. He did not offer legal counsel, but he said, "If you notify us, we can hold the records on our end for a short time while you pursue a formal request." He spoke as someone who had watched money move across ledgers for years and knew it rarely erased itself. Each person arrived with a role and the kind of calm that came from practice. They did not promise outcomes, they promised process. That steadied Marin more than anything. They gathered in the kitchen, 2 laptops open, a printed list pinned to the fridge. Lydia drew up, quickly and in direct language, a list of immediate actions. Secure the original images and devices in sealed bags. Email a notice to the hotel requesting preservation of logs and video footage where available. Send a preservation letter to telecommunications providers asking them to retain records for specific dates. Prepare a subpoena template for bank transfers and prepare witness lists. "Remember," Lydia said, "the court doesn't care about drama, it cares about integrity. Chain of custody, verified timestamps, witness statements, these are what move the needle. We keep this clean and legal, no ambushes, no traps." Marin listened, cataloging her own fear and rage in a ledger of its own. Rage, she recognized, could be a force to either break from or build with. She chose to build. She could not unsee the hotel key. She could not unknot the ledger's dates. She could, however, convert what she had into something that would stand up under scrutiny. That was the work of dignified resistance. They rehearsed language. Lydia taught Marin a few short declarative lines. "I am seeking the truth," she said, "for my child and for my family." The phrasing was careful, intended to cut through tabloids and rumor. Marin practiced silence as much as speech. Sometimes refusal to be performative was the strongest public statement.
Jonah set up a secure cloud drive. He demonstrated, in a low voice and simple terms, how the images would be hashed, each file given a unique string, and how they would keep a mirrored copy offline. We archive the originals, he said. We create copies for review. We document every access. That way, if anyone challenges the integrity of the files, we have a clear trail. They opened the leather journal carefully and read 2 short entries aloud, not in a way that indulged the private, but to pin down fact, dates, columns of numbers, shorthand that suggested arrangement and payment. Names were penciled in the margin. A passage noted a retainer, another a donation. Lydia underlined a phrase about project support. This could be valuable, she said, but it's documentation. We trace it. We don't dramatize it. Marin set up a schedule to keep Isla's nights predictable. Catherine took over the dinner plans. Rena insisted on making cookies. The presence of small domestic rituals, coffee at dawn, homework read aloud, became an act of resistance against the spectacle that threatened to widen. When the conversation turned to public exposure, the choice was not theater and not quiet retraction. It was a legal and ethical calculus. Leo Sinclair was the city's most visible benefactor. Board seats, philanthropic signatures, a name on the new wing of the community center Marin had helped to plan. The gala where the Sinclair Foundation would be honored was 2 weeks away. Leo loved stages and speeches. He loved applause. For many, the gala was his season of affirmation. We could go to trial and never see the public account of what happened, Lydia said, or we could use his platform under tightly controlled circumstances to present authenticated evidence, if that's what you want. But you need to understand the risks. Public exposure changes the legal landscape. It brings media. It brings pressure. It may accelerate negotiations, or it could complicate the legal process. We weigh it. Jonah and Benjamin exchanged a look that balanced tech and press. Benjamin said carefully, "If you choose that stage, we must be methodical. The evidence must be peer-reviewed, authenticated, and accompanied by a legal statement."
Public sympathy can be fickle. Clarity is what endures. The group rehearsed contingencies. If the hotel delivered logs that revealed matching dates, if the bank transfers aligned with the ledger, if audio held an exchange referencing corporate funds, each of those would be another tile in a mosaic that could carry weight. But Lydia reminded them that even a mosaic required the solid mortar of chain of custody and admissibility. There was an ethical backstop in the room. If any evidence was obtained through questionable means, they would not use it. Marin had no appetite for a sensational victory that rested on shaky ground. Catherine, who had spent a career nursing difficult civic projects through bureaucratic thickets, reminded the room that the work was not about revenge, but about accountability and, eventually, reform. "We make this about systems," she said, "not just one man's mistakes." That night, Marin sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She read and reread the leather journal entries. The ink bled slightly at the edges, but the meaning was steady. Dates, initials, shorthand that mapped appointments and transfers. On the desk nearby, Jonah worked with the audio. He ran a scrub to clean up background noise, and then, with a technician's gentleness, isolated a half-minute of a conversation where Leo's voice unmistakably referenced a payment with a phrase that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Lydia insisted on labeling the clip precisely and storing the original file untouched. At times, Marin felt as if she were watching her life from behind a glass. The familiar things, Issa's shoes, Leo's cufflinks, the sofa where they had watched movies, were now documents in a case she was building. She hated the legalization of intimacy. She accepted its necessity. Sleep came late and shallow. Morning found Marin practicing being present for a 9-year-old who deserved constancy. Isla asked about the gala. She had learned the word at school and liked the way it sounded. Marin did not lie. She said, "Sometimes grown-ups have to take care of big problems."
Isla nodded, content with the simplicity, and ran to her room to play with a model of a transit station Marin bought last winter. Over the next days, they moved through small, exacting tasks. Jonah wrote and filed a preservation request to the downtown hotel, asking that the reservation logs and any keycard records be retained. He sent a separate preservation request to the telecom provider for metadata associated with specific numbers and dates. Lydia drafted a preservation letter to the Sinclair Foundation's offices, requesting their ledgers and internal records be safeguarded. Tomas placed a temporary hold on certain account information pending formal request from counsel. Each request used neutral legal language, preserve for potential litigation.
Each step created a bulletin trail that Lydia explained would be crucial if they later moved to subpoena documents. Marin learned to view the chain of custody like a spine. If any vertebra was missing or broken, a phone passed hand to hand with no log, a file altered, an email destroyed, it could compromise the whole structure. One afternoon, Benjamin sat across from Marin with a notebook. He asked about the human part of the story. He wanted to know what it felt like to discover betrayal in your own home. Marin told him the truth. How a scent could become a verdict, how a photograph could feel like a shard, how small domestic items, an unpaired sock, a child's drawing, could suddenly carry the weight of evidence. Benjamin listened and wrote with care. He asked if Marin wanted the story public. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "If it helps other women, and if it helps push for clearer accounting when public donations cross into private deals, then yes, but I will not let my daughter's life be a spectacle." Within a week, they had a dossier. Photographs, hashed files, the cleaned audio clip, copies of receipts, and a preliminary mapping of potential transfers. There were anomalies in the ledger that Lydia flagged. Some entries described consulting fees, others used shorthand that suggested a retainer or a discretionary fund. Tomas's banking contacts confirmed that some transfers could be traced, but legal process would be required to obtain full records. Lydia prepared a subpoena template and walked Marin through what depositions would likely entail. Sworn testimony, cross-examination, the slow process of discovery. Litigation can be slow, she said, and unpleasant. It forces facts into daylight, but it takes stamina. "Can I do this and keep Isa safe?" Marin asked. "You can, but you will need to shape the narrative when you choose to speak publicly. Keep the child's details private. Anchor your statements in documents we have verified." Marin felt the cool space of possibility open slightly. She envisioned a different kind of legacy, a center for young women in urban planning in her name, with a donation transparency policy that required donors to disclose source funds and avoid conflicts with city contracts. She imagined an amendment to the guidelines for philanthropic naming so that boards would more carefully vet potential conflicts. The impulse to convert private harm into public good, hard-won and ethical, began to feel like a North Star rather than a coping mechanism. Catherine, who had been reviewing the city's list of philanthropic naming policies, proposed a narrower formal ask for the foundation they would create, a transparency clause for any donation exceeding a set threshold to the community center, along with a public register of donors for projects that influenced city planning decisions. "This isn't just about Leo," she said. "It's about reducing the leverage of unaccountable philanthropy."
"We will need allies," Marin said, "people inside and outside the city who will stand for clear rules." They had them already. Rena, who would organize a community bake sale to raise awareness and save funds. Benjamin, who could hold a line of careful reporting. Dr. Amir, who could advocate for children's mental well-being in public statements. And Tomas, whose cooperation might streamline the paper trail should the legal process require it. Each ally offered a small but steady thing, a contact, a public statement of principle, a willingness to testify to patterns of behavior they had observed. The team built a timeline. It began with the first documented hotel stay. It followed with the ledger entries. It mapped the bank transfers that seemed to align with dates. It noted the cleaned audio clip and the witness statements from neighbors who had noticed unusual comings and goings. Each marker had a source and a preserved copy. Lydia advised that before any public presentation, every piece had to be checked, rehashed, and authenticated by an independent lab if possible. If we go public, she said, we will present facts that hold up under scrutiny. Marin rehearsed the idea of taking the stage away from Leo's hands. The gala would be his theatrical triumph. They considered making it the place where verified evidence would be presented, timed and framed in a way that could not be dismissed as opportunistic. But Lydia cautioned against ambush-style theatrics. We do not want to be seen as staging a spectacle, she said. We want to present documented evidence and a call for institutional reform. That is different. Jonah suggested they create a secure presentation that emphasized documentation and transparency, a concise, verifiable package presented to boards, donors, and the public. Benjamin advised that the press should receive copies of the authenticated materials and that a public statement be prepared in legal consultation, facts first, commentary second. Lydia warned that the moment of public release would likely trigger litigation maneuvers, emergency motions, restraining orders, threats of defamation claims. We proceed, she said, with the expectation that they will push back. Our role is to make sure the pushback finds no weakness. There were nights when Marin questioned her own motives. Was she pursuing justice or revenge? Catherine answered those nights with a steady reminder. Justice is not the same as cruelty. Justice is about correct accounting and consequences when someone mixes private interest with public influence. As the days folded forward, minor skirmishes tested their resolve. A cousin of Leo's called, offering apologies on his behalf and requesting a private meeting. Marin declined. A gossip columnist made an insinuation in an online piece. Lydia prepared a measured rebuttal and requested a correction. Someone anonymously left a typed note under the front door. Don't drag this into the public square.
Marin folded it and put it in the notebook she used for logging. On a rainy afternoon, Jonah returned from a lab with an external forensic confirmation. The audio file's cleaned waveform matched the original recording's hash signature. A forensic report, concise, devoid of rhetorical flourish, documented the cleaning process and the matching hashes. This is not verdict language, Jonah said. It's evidence of admissible continuity. An expert could explain it in court. Lydia read the report slowly and then said, "We have the scaffolding. We build carefully." Marin felt her backbone straighten. She was tired. She also felt a new kind of steadiness, tempered resolve. She began to imagine the gala as a pivot, not merely a reveal, but an opportunity to push for structural change. If the Sinclair Foundation would not willingly accept public accountability, then perhaps the city's boards, the non-profit sector, and the community could insist upon clearer rules. She wanted a transparency fund that supported women in urban planning, yes, but she also wanted a policy change, clearer disclosure of sources tied to municipal partnerships. She saw a room where young girls could learn civic design without being bound to the names of donors whose money had been used to obscure rather than illuminate. They compiled a briefing packet, select evidence, lab confirmations, a timeline, and a short public statement about accountability and dignity. Benedict, as in Benjamin, helped draft an op-ed that offered a lens into systemic problems rather than personal spectacle. It emphasized the civic issue, how the influence of private money could warp public projects if left unchecked.
They planned, too, for the private needs. Dr. Amir offered to run a few sessions with Isla to ensure she had a safe space to voice her feelings on her own terms. Rena arranged for a babysitting chain so that Marin could attend meetings without worrying about Issa's routine being disrupted. The small acts of care were not secondary, they were central to Marin's sense of worth in the fight. 1 week before the gala, Lydia sat with Marin and Catherine in a low-lit conference room. She put a plain manila folder on the table and opened it with the same care Marin had used on the leather journal. Inside were annotated copies of the ledger, hashes, timestamps, and a proposed talking points sheet. "If you decide to move forward with a public presentation," Lydia said, "we file a pre-release brief with the appropriate parties. We give notice to the board at the Sinclair Foundation and to key stakeholders. We provide verified materials to at least 2 independent auditors. We ensure the child's privacy is protected in all public statements." Marin listened and felt again that careful moral axis settle under her feet. She imagined standing at the podium, not in anger, but in a steady, factual voice. She imagined saying, "This is not about humiliation.
This is about how public influence and private accountancy intersect." She rehearsed her opening line until it felt natural. "I am here to ask for clarity and accountability." They left the meeting with a plan and a list of contingencies. One small victory punctuated the week. Tomas confirmed that the bank would hold records pending legal process. Lydia had a list of independent forensic auditors who could provide third-party verification should the team choose to go public. Benjamin arranged for an editor to receive the packet under embargo. The house felt like a staging ground now, a place where domestic life and public crusade existed in an uneasy but necessary balance. At night, Marin read Isla a chapter book and tucked her in under the same blanket they'd had since she was small. The ordinary rituals were clamps against erosion. They were also the thing Marin was building for, the small woman she protected, not merely a symbol, but a person with scraped knees and school projects. 2 days before the gala, Jonah called with news. He had found a ledger entry that corresponded to an account that had been labeled in shorthand. The entry's date matched an overnight stay. He had requested metadata from the hotel's reservation system. It was pending, but the hotel had placed a hold. "We are seeing pattern," Jonah said. "Not proof of motive, but pattern is important." Marin allowed herself one long, quiet moment in the garden at dusk, the house behind her, lights coming on upstairs like stars. The small planting of lavender she and Isla had tended waved in the breeze. She pressed her fingers into the damp earth. She thought of the transformation she wanted, a community room with a plaque that would not erase names, but would insist those who lent their names be transparent in return. She thought of the city she had worked to plan, streets that moved people, not just prestige. She thought of the ledger, the hotel key, the perfume, and the small hand that tugged at her sleeve each morning. There was a docket on her desk labeled Gala Presentation Contingency. Lydia had prepared 2 versions, a private brief for stakeholders and a public statement to accompany any release. They had scheduled a rehearsal with the independent auditor the day before the gala. They had also prepared for the legal responses that might follow. On the morning of the rehearsal, Marin woke with the tightness of someone standing on a precipice. She dressed simply, in a blouse that made her feel like herself, not weaponized but present. She kissed Isla on the forehead and promised a new cookie recipe on Saturday. She met the team at the community center, a neutral space that smelled of varnish and fluorescent light. Lydia brought the manila folder. Jonah brought a compact external drive with hashed verification and a printed chain of custody log. They ran through the presentation slowly. Lydia would make the legal scaffolding introduction. Jonas would explain the technical verifications. An independent auditor would vouch for the hashes. And Marin would deliver the public request for policy change and transparency, keeping Issa's privacy intact. Benjamin would serve as a conduit to provide the verified materials to the press under a strict embargo that allowed for legal filtration. They rehearsed what they would say if Leo sought an injunction. They rehearsed how to remain calm if cameras pressed. At the end of the rehearsal, Marin sat in the empty rows of chairs and felt a weight shift, less the crushing of betrayal and more the gravity of possibility. She had not come home to this, yet what had happened could be converted into something purposeful and structural. That, Catherine said as she reached over to squeeze her hand, was not a small thing. They did not yet reveal their plan publicly. They knew the exposure itself could fracture delicate legal processes. They also knew that a measured reveal could accelerate accountability. In private, Lydia reminded them repeatedly, integrity first, evidence second, public good third, justice in the measured sense as a byproduct of rigorous truth. A small thing happened as they closed the rehearsal. Issa's shoe, left in the aisle, caught Marin's eye. She bent to pick it up and found tucked inside a tiny folded paper boat Issa had made that morning. On the outside, in careful 9-year-old print, were the words, "For Mama, keep afloat." Marin laughed then, soft and startled, and carried the shoe and the paper boat to the car. They left the community center with a plan, with files secured in multiple locations, with a list of contacts who would stand by if the public moment arrived. The house, when Marin returned, felt both fragile and fortified. She locked the front door as habit. She walked through her rooms and placed a printed chain of custody log into a secure drawer. The days that followed were a blur of small confirmations. Hotel holds remained in place. Bank records showed preliminary alignment but would require subpoenas. Jonah scheduled a final independent verification. Lydia drafted a concise public statement that framed their potential release in terms of systemic advocacy rather than private denouncement. Benjamin worked with an editor to craft a context piece that would be subject to editorial review and legal vetting before publication. On the morning of the gala, there was a polite tension that hummed under Marin's skin. She had decided, after long conversations, that if the independent auditor confirmed the integrity of the materials and the preservation letters held, she would present a public demand at the gala for greater transparency and present select verified documents to stakeholders. The choice was not simple or vindictive. It was a tactical and moral calculus designed to make public policy follow from verified truth. She dressed that afternoon in a dark, unadorned dress, and beneath it, a sense of resolve. Isla was at a friend's house with Rena, who had insisted on taking her out to play. Catherine sat with Marin for a final moment, holding the small paper boat between them like a talisman. At the last minute, before she left, Marin opened the leather journal again, not to dwell, but to remind herself of the facts. In the margin, someone had written an address and a shorthand that Jonah had traced to an account name. She slid the journal into an evidence bag and sealed it. The zip closed with a faint click. She ran her thumb along it once. She did not know what would happen that evening. She did not want to imagine the worst. She did not want to expect the best. She wanted clarity, and she wanted to keep her daughter whole in a world that suddenly felt frayed. When she stepped into the taxi, she thought of lights, how they could illuminate as easily as they could glare. The city scrolled by in streaks of neon. Marin held the small paper boat in her palm. It was damp from the humidity. It seemed both impossibly fragile and stubbornly buoyant. Inside her bag, her phone vibrated once. The headline was simple: Sinclair Gala, Final Preparations. The rest of the world, for now, lived in previews and press notes. Marin closed her eyes and sat with a short, clean intention. Reveal the truth where truth belongs. Protect Issa's world. Build something that would outlast the headlines. She had a team. She had a plan. She had a child whose bedtime stories mattered more than any public spectacle. The night ahead would be decisive,
not in the sense of finality, but in the sense of a hinge. She breathed in the cool night air, a city that never quite slept, and felt the soft, steady thrum of resolve. They had rehearsed the words until they sat in Marin's mouth like small stones, true, hard, and necessary. Now the auditorium lights bladed down, and the room smelled of perfume and wool and the faint citrus of too many aftershaves. Chairs were a pattern of backs and shoulders, and the occasional flash of cameras beyond the press line. The gala hall had been transformed into Leo Sinclair's theater. Banners with his foundation's logo, a projection screen like a silent witness, a long table where trustees and city officials would sit for the evening's honors. Marin felt none of the performative hunger that filled the room. She felt only a clear steadiness, a sense of purpose that had the same weight as the leather-bound ledger in evidence bags at Jonah's custody. She had chosen a side of the room that allowed a quick exit. She had rehearsed being unflappable. She had rehearsed not because she wanted to be cold, but because she knew how gestures could be misread as theatrics. Tonight, clarity had to be the armor. Catherine waited with a small audience of allies near the wings.
Lydia made last-minute checks with the independent auditor, a woman whose expression carried the bluntness of lab reports and the quiet temperament of someone used to being believed only when numbers were unassailable. Jonah's laptop hummed in a padded case. Benjamin had given copies of the verified packet to 2 trusted editors under embargo. He stood at the back, a small stack of printed timetables in hand, ready to ensure the press line received materials on their terms. Leo arrived in measured pomp. He greeted the room in the practiced way of a man who had learned to give the right sound bites and collect applause. Cameras followed his smile. A few people, trustees and donors, rose to clap, an etiquette of civility that sometimes felt like a second language in philanthropy. He had not, in the prepared materials, acknowledged the rumors that rippled through social feeds. He had not yet been asked to. Marin watched him move like someone reading a familiar map. The difference tonight, however, was that the map would be reprinted with facts that did not yield to spin. On the projection screen, a simple slate read, "Transparency and Accountability, a Factual Briefing." It was unadorned by melodrama. It was legal scaffolding in public clothes. They opened with the independent auditor's statement, short, precise, and technical in a way that made it less susceptible to gossip. The auditor explained in carefully neutral language that the files provided by Marin's team had been verified. Hashes matched originals. Metadata showed timestamps consistent with the claimed dates. Audio cleaning preserved the original file's integrity. The slide showed a timeline with dots, hotel stay, ledger entries, transfers. The auditor's voice had no accusation. It only placed facts on the table. Then Lydia, with a voice that removed theatricality and left only consequence, laid out the purpose, not to humiliate, but to ask institutions to demand clearer disclosures when private donations interact with public projects. "This is a civic question," she said. "When private funds shape public spaces, boards, and procurement, the public deserves to know the source. We present verified materials and ask for institutional reforms, not sensational judgments." People murmured. Cameras leaned forward. Benjamin distributed the packet, copies to editors, copies to a small number of board chairs and city officials who had seats in the front rows. He moved like someone who understood what stories could do when they were given to the right hands. The press would have the facts. Editors would have time to check. That was intentional. Control of release, Lydia said, limited the chaos. When Marin stood, the room tightened. She had prepared lines that were neither theatrical nor cold. She simply let the facts be the forward motion of her voice. "I am not here to ruin anyone," she said. "I am here because public projects matter."
When private money is in the picture, transparency is not optional.
I am here for my daughter and for the people who trust our city to be built on clear standards, not hidden ledgers." She spoke the word ledgers slowly, so the air could carry it without castigating anyone. She did not list private intimacies. She did not need to. The projection behind her flicked through images, a hotel card photographed at the scene, a receipt with a timestamp, an excerpt from the ledger with a date that matched a transfer shown on the timeline. Each image carried its own brutal economy of fact. Someone in the crowd, an old friend of Leo's, rose and said quietly, "This is private family business." The remark landed like a gavel. Marin did not argue emotional territory. She pivoted to the civic. It becomes public when names and donations influence the decisions that shape our neighborhood schools, our parks, our transit, she said. If donors are to be named for buildings and programs, the public deserves to know whether those donors are exempt from conflicts that affect contractors, consultants, and city contracts. Her words were a swennet toward policy, not vendetta. The crowd felt that seam, and some people shifted, not all in sympathy, but in recognition that a line had been drawn between private error and public accountability. Cameras caught the expressions that would later be described as mixed reactions in morning recaps. The physics of optics had shifted in the room. The gala's light now also illuminated documents. Leo rose after Marin spoke, choosing to address the crowd in the cadences of a practiced leader. He acknowledged the allegations, a word designed to keep the legal door ajar, and insisted he had always tried to do right by the city. He did not, in that moment, offer clarity on the ledger. His statement was legally careful, designed, as Lydia had predicted, to slow public momentum. That was part of the calculus. Masonry moves one stone at a time. Marin had not expected instant confession. She had expected persecution of narratives, legal contortions, and the usual defenses. Her goal had always been less dramatic, to ensure the facts were known and to insist that public entities respond with policy. What followed was a week of controlled tectonics. The Sinclair Foundation's board convened emergency meetings. A number of trustees, those who had held seats for years and whose reputations hinged on fiduciary propriety, asked for independent audits. A small but vocal chorus in the city press demanded answers. Others advised caution. Leo's legal team fired off letters questioning the scope of what had been shared publicly and hinting at defamation claims. Lydia expected those letters and filed back with notices of preservation and a request for records, what she called, in calm terms, the formalization of our concerns. Depositions and discovery followed the public crescendo like a slower tide.
Leo submitted to a deposition that stretched for hours. The room for such moments is a strange, neutral place, a conference suite with cardboard cups of coffee and legal teams arranged like sentries. Depositions are not drama, they are a test of patience and clarity. Witness statements are reduced to lines, and cross-examination is the slow removal of plausible deniability. In the deposition, under oath, Leo's answers began measured and evasive in the method legal counsel trains for. He explained various entries as consulting fees or project retainer, phrases meant to sketch business, not personal arrangement. Lydia moved through the ledger with the determination of someone cataloging architecture. She asked for clarifications about dates and contractors. She presented bank transfers that Tomas had been able to flag. The pattern was now visible in the paperwork. Amounts moved on dates that matched ledger shorthand and hotel stays Marin had photographed. The cracks were not dramatic confessions, they were procedural and cumulative. Under direct questioning about entries tied to a named contractor, Leo fumbled, searching his own mind for a plausible sequence. On the tape of that deposition, a moment held of ordinary human fatigue, a pause, a misremembered line, the wrong year offered for an entry. It was not proof of malice, but it was a small opening. Marin did not watch the deposition live. She had been advised to remain distant. She respected the advice because she had learned that law prefers documents and sworn testimony to theatrics. She sat instead with Catherine at home in a living room that smelled like baking bread and allowed herself ordinary tasks, folding a load of laundry, helping Ela with a puzzle, because that ordinariness was, in part, the shield she had vowed to keep. The legal process wended onward. Subpoenas went to hotels and to financial institutions. Some records were turned over under compulsion, others arrived in heavily redacted form. Leo's defense tried to depict the ledger entries as part of a long-standing practice of earmarked consulting fees. Lydia and her team parsed each redaction and asked for fuller disclosure. At the same time, public relations teams warred in the media. Statements that emphasized Leo's philanthropy, statements that counseled patience, and op-eds that argued both for and against the public airing of private matters. There were missteps. Someone in a minor outlet published an unverified rumor based on a social media tip. Lydia moved fast to correct inaccuracies and to keep the narrative focused on verified materials. Benjamin, writing cautiously, emphasized the institutional questions rather than personalities. That editorial line helped shape the city's discourse. It reframed the story away from scandal to systemic risk. People began to ask whether standards for naming rights and donor vetting might be tightened.
The board of the community center, the one that carried Leo's name in its wing, agreed to review its policies. Behind the media moves, negotiations began. Leo's counsel sent a proposal that offered to negotiate a settlement if confidentiality could be preserved. Lydia counseled caution. Settlements can be instruments of both resolution and avoidance. They can deliver restitution or simply silence. Lydia's job was to test the offer and to ensure that any agreement included structural outcomes that reduced the chance of similar abuses. The team wanted more than money. Catherine wanted a clause that required disclosure thresholds for any future donations affecting municipal projects. Marin wanted a fund, not as a trophy, but as a durable mechanism of restitution and public good, a transparency fund supporting young women pursuing civic careers, coupled with a public register for named donations tied to municipal projects. Negotiation moved slowly. Leo's team wanted to cap liability and protect reputation. Lydia pushed for a public component and independent oversight. They argued over language. Weeks of discussions compressed into terse emails and formal settlement drafts. Lydia insisted on independent auditors, on a binding transparency clause, on a restorative fund overseen by an independent board that included community representatives and someone from Marin's network. The concept was simple: convert a private misaccounting into a structural fix that reduced leverage and increased accountability. At each step, Marin felt the gravity of trade-offs. Settlement could bring closure and funds for the initiatives she imagined. It could also be criticized as a quiet exchange that let accountability remain partial. Marin wanted policy. Lydia insisted on enforceability, monitoring, reporting, and an independent compliance mechanism. They drafted language that required annual audits and public posting of donations that met a threshold tied to municipal naming rights. After bargaining and legal formalities, Leo's team offered a settlement that included restitution for community projects and the creation of a transparency fund. It also included a clause: Leo would step down from certain trusteeships and allow for an independent review of his foundation's donor reporting practices. It was not perfect, no settlement ever is, but for Marin it struck a balance, an acknowledgement, a structural win, and the money and policy vehicle to create what she had imagined. The settlement included confidentiality around specific personal details, but did not prevent the city from implementing policy changes. In the public statement that accompanied the agreement, Lydia and Marin crafted a refrain they hoped would endure: "We will convert this breach of trust into a program that strengthens transparency in civic philanthropy and expands opportunities for young women pursuing careers in urban planning." A donor in another city,
who had read about the Sinclair case and the Foundation's rules, altered his own practices, requiring staff in his foundation to submit donor disclosures and creating an in-house audit. A university's urban planning department invited Marin to lecture about the intersection of gifts and public policy. The conversation slowly spread beyond the local press rooms into academic forums where the interplay between private influence and public infrastructure was parsed in syllabi. Marin found herself sometimes exhausted by the pace of public expectation. She still loved concrete things, the smell of a new plan set, the small pleasure of a child's drawing taped to a refrigerator. She kept that into the work. The Foundation's first grant went to a neighborhood group that wanted to fix hazardous crosswalks near schools. It was low glamour and high consequence. The board celebrated that decision in a way Marin preferred, quietly, with an Instagram post about crosswalk safety and a small ceremony where children drew chalk paths through the pavement. Leo's public profile waned as trustees shuffled and the media moved to the next cycle. His private life retreated by degrees into the background, but the influence of the ledger had been translated, imperfectly but usefully, into a public instrument. The Foundation was not a perfect antidote. It was a practice. Marin kept reminding the team that institutional change is incremental and requires sustained vigilance. Years later, the transparency clause they had helped to seed at the community center was tested. A major donor offered funds for a new theater wing. The board asked for full disclosure and independent verification. The donor's records revealed a complex web of sources, some problematic, some permissible. The board refused the gift until the donor agreed to make long-form disclosure and to accept an oversight arrangement they had proposed. The refusal made headlines. Some criticized the board, others praised it. The incident, however, proved the principle Marin had argued. When institutions insist on transparency, they force the choices into daylight. Marin's own life resumed a quieter cadence. She continued work as an urban planner on smaller projects that mattered to neighborhoods. The Foundation's programs occupied a significant portion of her time, but she found the balance by setting firm boundaries. She walked Isla to school when she could and sat on the porch in the evenings with Catherine, who tended the lavender like a patient gardener of civic reform. The small domestic images sustained Marin in ways that no policy victory could replicate. She braided Isla's hair on Sunday mornings, made a pie for Rena's charity bake sale, and read aloud from the same chapter book at night until Isa would slide like a small leaf into sleep. They made plans for a summer trip to the coast, where Isa could build ephemeral cities of sand without an eye toward governance.
In time, the Foundation did something Marin had hoped for, but not assumed. It bought a modest parcel of land near the transit corridor Marin had once championed and funded a series of workshops for girls and young women to learn about civic design. They offered stipends and mentorships and published annual reports that were a model of clarity. Each donor listed with amounts, the purpose of each grant described, and independent audit summaries appended. People began to cite those reports as examples in grant-making courses. The community room in the center was more than a plaque and more than a site for PR. It functioned as a space where neighbors could convene input sessions on planning decisions, review procurement contracts, and host civic education nights for kids. It became, slowly, a place where names and numbers were discussed in daylight and not in the whispering backrooms that had once distorted projects. Marin's sense of what victory meant altered. It was less about the fall of a man and more about altering the grammar of civic life so that future deals would not be so easy to obscure. She learned to accept small structural wins in place of dramatic reckonings. The ledger had not been a line that broke the city. It was a caution that required redesign. On a warm evening years after the gala, Marin walked the small garden behind the community center. Children's feet thudded in the nearby playground.
The lavender she had planted with Isla had grown and thickened. A plaque near the garden listed the Transparency Fund's key provisions and the phone number to request public copies of reports. People came by to look up donor records in a manner that, once, would have sounded excessive. Now it read as ordinary civic hygiene. She met Catherine and Isa on the path. Isla's hair was in a ponytail. She had a smudge of paint on her cheek from a school mural project. She ran to her mother and presented a new paper boat she had folded in class. "This one floats on policy," she said, laughing at herself in a child's earnest metaphor. Marin kissed her forehead and tucked the boat into her palm. Catherine watched them and then looked at Marin with a softness that had survived the year's travail. "You turned something hard into a tool," she said. "That's not small." Marin thought of Jonah and Lydia, of Benjamin, Rena, Dr. Amir, and Tomas, all the people who had stayed in forms of small constancy. She thought of the leather journal now archived in a secure, law-locked file, and of the hashes Jonah had preserved. They were instruments that had been used to insist on clarity, and then placed in institutional hands to be managed responsibly. The chain of custody had become, in a way, a chain of accountability. They walked home as lights bloomed in windows like small stars. The city around them vibrated with ordinary business, shops closing, a late bus pulling away, the faint smell of someone grilling dinner.
Marin felt the day's tiredness line her shoulders, but it was the kind that followed work well done. She felt less the sharpness of the old humiliation and more the cool, sustained satisfaction of systems nudged toward better practice. Before bed, she checked her email and saw a note from the city's planning director. The new volunteer oversight board was seeking a few speakers for civic workshops, and they wanted the foundation to lead the next session. She replied with a short, steady sentence, "We will come." Marin sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. The paper boat on the windowsill bobbed gently when a draft brushed past. She remembered the unlocked door and the perfume and the hotel key like relics from someone else's film. Those things had altered her life. They had made public questions unavoidable and shaped a response that, in the end, became a common good. She found Jonah's old sequence of hashed files in a folder they still kept for legal purposes, and she did something small. She printed the audit summary and slipped it into a new binder with the label Transparency Fund Governance. It was a tidy, bookish gesture, but it mattered to Marin. Bureaucracy had become an instrument of dignity. At the window, she watched Isla sleep, small and ordinary, and thought of the future. A city where children would be taught that public life requires public clarity, and that names given to buildings and seats of power come with accountability. The thought felt taut and right. Outside, on the porch, Rena had left a bag with warm bread and a note, for Sunday. Marin smiled, tired and grateful. The city hummed, the foundation pulsed. The ledger, once a secret shorthand, had been translated into a public ledger of sorts, rules, audits, a register. Marin stood and folded into bed, the house breathing around her. The last thing she did before sleep was tuck the new paper boat she had been given into a small wooden box where she kept a few objects that marked the life she had made. Isla's first drawing, a photograph of the transit model, and a small pebble from a seaside trip they had taken in a quieter year. The box was a repository of ordinary things that traced continuity and care. In the morning, Marin opened the Foundation's inbox and read messages from young women applying for the pilot mentorship program. She read a note from a teacher who wanted to bring a class to the community room. She answered both with brief, warm replies, and then washed a coffee cup and set it on the counter. Years had not erased the past. There were legal processes that lingered, formal audits that needed attention, and trustees who still argued in closed sessions about thresholds and enforcement. But the pattern
an individual betrayal converted into a structural instrument to prevent repeat behavior, had been established in a way that mattered. On the corner of her desk, she kept the small journal Catherine had given her the first month after the discovery.
Its pages had a faint smell of lavender. On its cover she had written once in haste, "Keep the chain." She smiled and erased the word chain with a careful hand, then wrote beneath it, "Keep the public." She prepared for a speaking event at the school the next day, a session with students about civic design and ethics. She pictured Isa in the back row, perhaps bored or perhaps listening with the half-smile of a child who trusts that adults can do small, decent things. Before she left the house, she opened her phone and typed a short message to the Foundation's social account, a note that would go out to subscribers with an update about the mentorship program and a link to the public donor register. The message was modest. It invited people to learn, to participate, and to keep public oversight as an ordinary expectation. She added a final line, a small call to action that was not about sensationalism, but about civic life. Follow our work for resources, updates, and ways to support transparency in civic giving. It was concise and purposeful. It was the single CTA the story had been waiting to place, an invitation to join a practice of accountability rather than the spectacle of a scandal. Marin closed the door behind her and walked out into a city that was not perfect, but felt, in the small structural ways that mattered, a bit more honest. She held Isa's paper boat in her bag, fragile and buoyant as always. The ledger had not defined them, their response had. That response would be a living thing, a fund and a set of policies and a community room where sunlight hit the varnished floor and people could learn that names meant obligations. She stepped into the morning and for once felt the light warm rather than expose.